Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we have Dr. Felix Cheung, who will discuss adolescent screen time and well-being. Felix will speak for around 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, if you have a clarifying question, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, please keep your microphones muted. As a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Dr. Felix Cheung. He is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Population Wellbeing at the University of Toronto, St. George. Dr. Cheung directs the Population Wellbeing Lab, founded the Canadian Happiness Report, and co-authored the 2025 World Happiness Report. He is a member of the World Wellbeing Panel and co-leads the McGill and University of Toronto Wellbeing Research Seminar. He was also recognized as a rising star by the Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Cheung's research examines the determinants, consequences, and policy relevance of a satisfying, purposeful, and engaging life. He takes an interdisciplinary perspective to examine population well-being in relation to pressing global issues. Without further ado, I believe everyone is excited to hear what you have to say today about screen time and well-being. Felix, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Kelsey, for that lovely introduction. So I don't have to talk about all of this. I have a slide prepared to introduce my lab. And instead, maybe I would just say that my name Felix is Latin for happiness, and also happen to do happiness research. So that's kind of neat. I think of my lab as a generalist lab where we study, a lot of different things and how they relate to subjective well-being. And I think the reason why I want to frame this a little bit broader is that the reason why we went into screen time and adolescent well-being is because of a broader observation. So at least based on psychological research on subjective well-being, there are a lot of studies that have converged and say things along the line of, things like green space, leisure time, spending on experiences are things that are great for subjective well-being. And if in the world we have unlimited space, time, and money, those advice would be great. We can just have unlimited green space, unlimited leisure time, and unlimited money to spend on experiences. However, one shared observations across these different domains of research is that it sounds like we're not taking seriously that all of these resources are fundamentally limited. They're scarce resources. Space, time, money are ultimately limited. We only have so much. And in fact, if we have abundant time, space, and money, all of us would probably be already pretty happy. So we felt like, there's a much more serious and important question to ask about, like, how do we spend scarce resources in the best possible way to improve well-being? So I want to place our study into this broader context before I jump into adolescent time use and well-being. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that this is kind of the screen time team in my lab, and this is like all really the work led by my fourth-year PhD student, Elizabeth Chan. And without them, this wouldn't be possible. And if you see anything that you like throughout the talk, all the credit go to all these lovely people that I work with, and all the mistakes are mine. So there has been so much public conversation about whether or not screen time is good or bad for adolescent well-being. And probably if you are interested enough to sign up for this, I probably don't have to summarize this, but I would broadly say that there has been a lot of concerns about whether or not screen time is hurting youth mental health and their subjective well-being. But once you zoom into the scientific literature, the evidence seems to be a lot more mixed. So on one hand, I would say that there's a part of the literature or a group of researchers that seems to be, arguing forcefully about how screen time tends to be associated with poor well-being. On the other hand, this is, a screenshot of the well-known potato paper that says that even though sometimes digital technology is linked to lower well-being, the association tends to be very small. And in fact, it's so small that it probably does not warrant all this like conversation. So, existing evidence is very mixed. And I also want to, so in this context, I want to preface my talk by saying, by clarifying what this talk is about and what this talk is not about. So what this talk is about is that I go into a little bit more depth about a possible reason why I think existing evidence is mixed. And building on that, we'll point to the kind of data and statistical method that we need to answer this question more comprehensively. And hopefully, with this type of tools, it would give us the language to move us closer to building consensus. At the same time, I want to be very clear about what this talk is not about. I'm going to present some empirical studies, but they're by no means, telling you like a definitive answer with like perfect causal inference to tell you precisely, how screen time is linked to adolescent well-being. And I would think of the empirical studies, obviously, are studies that are solid, but they're more illustrative and point us to a promising direction for a new direction or a new generation of time use research. Okay, so again, there's a lot of mixed evidence. There doesn't, at least based on the scientific literature, there doesn't seem to be a decisive support for a negative association between screen time and well-being. And we think that's partly because past research tend to focus on total screen time and rarely treats time as limited. A typical study in the screen time literature would ask adolescents to report how much time they're spending on screen time, 0 hour, 1 to 2 hour, 2 to 3 hours, and try to mental well-being outcome. The problem with this approach is that because time is limited, an association between screen time and life satisfaction, for example, could be due to either an increase in screen time or a decrease in non-screen time. Again, the intuition here is that we all only have 24 hours. An increase in screen time has to come at the expense of something else. It could be sleep, it could be exercising, it could be just sitting around doing nothing, it could be having a meal. But just given the fact that time is limited, this trade-off is a fundamental part of screen time. And the reason why this perspective is important is that it means past research that only focus on screen time may not be telling us anything about screen time, because any significant observation, significant association could be due to changes in some non-screen time use. To give some intuitive example, given there's also a separate and large literature on how sleep tends to be good for people's well-being, a possibility here is that sacrificing sleep for more screen may be bad for people's well-being. And on the other hand, given the literature on commuter stress and how commuting tends to be a less pleasant part of the day, sacrificing commuting and spending more time on screen, well, that may be like a fine thing, or maybe even like give you more well-being. So again, our core argument here is that there's a fundamental opportunity cost associated with time use, and screen time research has largely neglected this fundamental feature of time. Having said that, the displacement hypothesis is pretty prominent in the screen time literature. And very broadly, it's about how screen time is problematic because it may displace time on more fruitful activities like socializing. Even though there's this conceptual hypothesis, we rarely have the kind of data or statistical approach to properly model this. And that's what we're trying to address in this talk. And specifically, I'm just going to focus on socializing in the first part of my talk. And the argument here, again, is that screen time is problematic because it replaces socializing time. To test this displacement hypothesis, we need to account for trade-off in time use. There are many different ways that people can socialize. People may displace family time, peer time, or alone non-screen time for screen time. And based on the displacement hypothesis as commonly known, I think the prediction is that it's mostly about sacrificing socializing time for screen time. That's bad for well-being. And the displacement hypothesis may not make clear hypothesis about how alone screen time compared to alone non-screen time. So to be able to apply this method, we need to have 24-hour time use diary data and use a statistical technique that's called compositional data analysis. Compositional data analysis is specifically developed for compositional variable, where it's a predictor where all the parts add to a constant sum. So no matter what we spend our time on, everything adding up together will always add up to 24 hours. So time use, in other words, is a compositional variable that is perfect for compositional data analysis. So again, to summarize a little bit, our research question is, does increasing screen time at the expense of social time predict subjective well-being? There are several things that make this study interesting. One is that coming from psychology, we use an process called pre-registration, meaning that we write down the data that we're going to use, how we're going to analyze the data, how we're going to define the outcome before we touch the data, and we put it into a timestamp online platform. The reason why pre-registration, I believe, is especially important for research on screen time and adolescent mental well-being is that there are a lot of beliefs about screen time, and if we don't pre-register, we may give more room for our bias to either consciously or unconsciously seep into the research process and bias our result. So there's a development that happened in the past 10 years of psychology where
Francesco, do you hear Felix?
oh,
Oh,
can
no.
you hear me?
Sorry,
No, it froze.
Felix, we lost you for 5-10 seconds. You were
Okay.
finishing on the pre-registration and the benefits of doing this within psychology.
Okay, yeah. So one sentence summary, the reason why pre-registration is important is that it kind of keep our personal value at bay, it tie our hands a little bit to make sure that we're approaching the question with the most rigorous method, and that we won't be able to cherry pick or anything. You can verify our approach with our pre-registration to see whether or not we follow through with it. We pick a very particular data set. It's called the Millennium Cohort Study done in the UK. And the reason why we've picked this study is that as far as we can tell, and please let us know if you know of other data, as far as we can tell, this is the only data in the world where they have adolescent time use diary data and some kind of well-being outcome. So that's pretty special. You see representative birth cohort that started in the year 2000. And we focus on the data coming from the survey that were done when participants age 14 and 17. And then age 14, participants reported their time use. It goes from 4 a.m. to 4 a.m. From 4 a.m. in the morning to 4 a.m. To 4 a.m. for the past day to 4 a.m. on today, so to get a 24-hour time use. Participants can report their time used by every 10-minute slot, so it's pretty detailed. And there are very good evidence to suggest that this type of time use diary is comparable to the gold standard. I learned about the gold standard when I went to a time use conference, and apparently the gold standard in time use research is to have a trained interviewer who actually follow you around and documenting your time use. And that may not be very feasible to do this in an adolescent setting. So in any case, this is comparable, reliable data on time use, even when compared to this type of gold standard. Participants were asked to complete a time use diary on a randomly selected weekday and a weekend day, just to acknowledge that adolescents are spending their time in very different ways, on weekdays versus weekends. And there are many ways to categorize time use. For the purpose of this particular study, we categorize time based on social time. So importantly, we have alone screen time. And then we can also compare this with, sibling time, peer time, time with mother, time with father, alone non-screen time. Just to see how, like, what kind of time use is best for adolescent well-being. And as you can see, this start to go beyond the screen time literature. There's also, literature on adolescent well-being in terms of whether or not it's good to spend me time, so to speak, spend time in solitude or spend time with family, spend time with peers. We believe this is particularly important because at age 14 is when adolescents start to build some independence and having some agency over how they want to use their time. So there's also like an important developmental stage to be thinking about this. Our outcome is a life satisfaction measure focusing on age 14. So this is a cross-sectional contemporaneous measure. So again, this study is not about perfect causal inference, but we do feel like there are some important methodological advances here. We did control for things like age, family income, ethnicity, household arrangement, school type, rural, urban divide, things like that. We also control for the type of activity, so whether or not they're sleeping, whether or not they're eating, things like that. And we also want to focus, we basically also did some basic check to make sure that that day is a kind of like a typical day without like extreme outlier, like, they actually sleep, things like that. Here are just some basic descriptive on how kids are spending their time. This, again, based on data from 2014, so a little bit dated now. And we found that participants spend about 2 hours per day on weekday and on weekend. As a new father, I feel a little bit sad to see that, apparently the average UK kid only spend about 15 minutes, 0.25 hour with their dad on a weekday. And that seems, I don't know, just something I think about when I'm doing this. Yeah, so there's just some basic descriptive to place the rest of the result into context. Okay, so I think the next slide is going to look a little bit crazy, but I think this is the key result, and I'm going to walk you through this, okay? So what we're looking at here is something called one-to-one comparison. We can look at how alone screen time at the bottom compared to how displacing time used for alone screen time predict well-being. Okay, let me take a step back and again talk about what CODA is. What compositional data analysis is. In a traditional regression setting, we're testing how an increase in the predictor is associated with the outcome. In a compositional data analysis setting, we're testing how the increase in one predictor and a drop in another predictor predicts well-being. So here, we're looking at how all the time use comparison across all social time use predicts well-being. And we use this thing that's called a cost diagram because we have something like 8 time use domains and they can be compared with each other. And we're trying to plot something like, 60 association on the one figure. And that's why this looks complicated. But we're going to walk through this, okay? So you see that, each arrow is pointing to something. Okay, I'm going to bring up my cursor. So there's an arrow that go from alone screen time to say alone non-screen time. So this green arrow right here. When we have arrow pointing from one domain to another, it means if we reduce alone screen time and instead spend it on alone non-screen time, that predicts an improvement in well-being. Okay. So just to practice, let's go for another one. So let's look at this one that goes from alone screen time to family time. Again, the arrow goes from alone screen time to family time. It means if we reduce alone screen time and spend more time with the entire family, we expect improvement in life satisfaction. So the fact that all the arrows are going from alone screen time to all the other things does, in fact, support the idea that screen time does not appear to be great for people's life satisfaction. And in fact, reducing alone screen time to spend time in a different way should predict improvement in life satisfaction. I do want to point out several that are statistically significant. So, compared to family time, alone non-screen time, and pure time, spending more time on alone screen time hurts well-being. I'm using hurts in a association kind of way. I don't necessarily imply a causal claim. But I thought I would like to particularly draw your attention to alone non-screen time, because that kind of go against the idea that it's purely about socializing. Like, all of us are on the phone, we're not socializing, that's why it's bad for our well-being. But perhaps that's oversimplifying. And in fact, for adolescents to spend alone non-screen time can actually also be beneficial. The idea here is that, again, me time can be a time to nurture that sense of independence, nurture a sense of solitude at this particular developmental stage. Another major advantage I want to point out, if we do have 24-hour time use diary and compositional data analysis, is that we can think about this in broader terms. It's no longer just about screen time. We can even think about, should kids be spending time with their peers? Should kids be spending time with their families? Should kids be spending time with their father? Things like that. So a 24-hour time use approach allow us to think much broader. The question now becomes, how can kids spend their limited time for a better life? And we can also look at comparison in non-time use domains. I mean, non-screen time domains. There may still be some questions and confusion, so I'm just going to walk you through another example from the result on the weekends, but then if you still have questions, this may be a good time to ask. So now let's look at the weekend results. So they do look very different. Again, I will walk you through a couple of examples just to make sure that we're understanding just what I'm showing you here. So here's alone screen time. Can people see my cursor?
Yes.
So here's alone screen time, and we can see this thick arrow going from alone screen time to father time. And it means that we spend less time on the weekend on alone screen time and more time with father. We expect an improvement in life satisfaction. And again, you can see that all of the arrows are pointing from alone screen time to other time use domain, meaning that it generally tends to be negative. I do want to clarify, the thickness of the arrow is implying the magnitude or the effect size. So that's why there are arrows of different sizes.
Felix, yeah, I was going to ask a clarifying question about that.
Please.
Is it possible from this to understand the exact magnitude, or is it really just we should infer from the thickness of the lines? And in another way of stating it, the markers along the exterior of the circle, what do those mean? And the width of, let's say, father time is much larger now than it was on the previous slide, where it was virtually zero.
That's a great question. And yes, if the audience can see the numbers, the markings does correspond to the magnitude. So let's focus on father time for a moment. Let me bring up my cursor. So father time is here on the top right. So first, just look at the entire marker for father time. It goes from 0 to 0.24. It means if we are redistributing all other time used into father time, we can expect something like a 0.24 unit increase in life satisfaction. So, we expect, a sizable benefit if we spend more time with our dad. And this also applies to a specific arrow. This also applies to a specific arrow. So again, let's focus on alone screen time going to father time. And if we look at the marker, it goes from around 0.13 to around 0.19. So about 0.06 difference. So it suggests that if we redistribute alone screen time to father time, we expect a 0.06 unit increase in life satisfaction. So all of those are meaningful. if I remember correctly, we're plotting this based on 10 minutes or an hour. I mean, if you ask, or we may need to ask my student or look in the paper for clarification. But the idea is that this is corresponding to a unit of time. But sorry, I forget whether or not we plot it by 10 minutes or plot it by an hour. Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead if you have another.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's helpful. Thank you. Much more sense. Thanks.
Yeah, so again, I think one of the takeaway that I want the audience to take away from is, again, like the benefit of this approach is that we can think broader than just screen time. So I'm also going to walk through some other domains. So for example, father time and mother time, there are a lot of arrows pointing to it. It suggests that spending time with our mom, spending time with our dad is great. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we found that sleep time on the weekend also may not be too great, and we found generally, the arrows are pointing out, suggesting that like spending more time elsewhere would be nice. And you can see some domains where the arrows going in and coming back, and that suggests that whether or not spending time on that domain is good or bad will be very dependent on how the trade-off work. Here we highlight the lack of association with peer time, because again, that would go against the traditional idea around displacement hypothesis that it is about how sacrificing peer spending time with peer for screen that's bad for well-being. Although we found this in weekday, we did not find this on weekend. So we also apply similar technique to look at, I think, over 25 different developmental outcomes. So there are things like self-esteem, internalizing symptom, externalizing symptoms, just to look at outcomes that are other than well-being to provide a fuller picture on how alone screen time is linked to all sorts of different outcomes. So what we're seeing here is called a Manhattan plot. Each dot represents the association between time used in one domain with another outcome. Okay, if this feels like a lot, I would just want you to focus on alone screen time. Okay, if a dot go past this gray dotted line, it means that you're statistically significant after correction for multiple comparison. And the fact that there are 4 red dots, 4 red circles that are above that gray line means that alone screen time is linked to some negative outcome at age 14 contemporaneously. And we also use triangle to look at adolescent outcome 3 years from then, so when they're age 17, to test whether or not there are prospective association that we can detect. And long story short, there's actually no statistically significant findings. So I think as a whole, I think our study would give people on both sides of the debate something to like, so to speak. On one hand, when we look at the cross-sectional finding, there are certain findings that seems to confirm the perspective of researchers who believe that screen time is bad, so to speak. But on the other hand, when we look at the 3-year follow-up, we did not see any statistically significant association. Sorry, Francesco, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but now it occurred to me that you have 2 waves of data. And so I'm wondering, are these within people changes? How should we interpret this?
Yeah, thank you for asking the clarification question. So time use is only measured cross-sectionally at age 14. There's no time use data at age 17, so we're not able to test for within-person changes in how adolescents are spending their time. The critique on the limitation on the causal claim that we can infer from this is well taken. And I think our biggest point that come out of our whole effort is basically we need way more time use study to do this. So I think the lack of data is true, is discipline-wide. And if you're concerned about this, we totally acknowledge that our study may not be able to draw stronger inference that we have hoped for. But still, again, the idea of recognizing how, if we have extensive time use data, we'll be able to do like much more interesting time use research. I hope that the broader point is communicated to you and the audience.
No, you've been very clear, but my point was not really about whether you're using, fixed effects or not. But now I see that you have two waves of data. So this means that you have two repeated cross sections, or this is just the two samples, one for the weekdays and one for the weekend. I got confused by this wave.
Okay.
Variable here.
Yeah. So the wave. Oh, I think I just put wave 6 and wave 7, and that is the language that's used in MCS.
That's right.
So that's on me. Now I get your question. So wave 6 is done in age 14. That's when all the time use data are collected. Wave 7 is when all the adolescents are age 17. So we're using adolescent time use data at age 14 to see whether or not we can predict developmental outcomes at age 17.
Okay. So these are the pool data for 14 and 17 years old.
Yeah.
Adolescents.
And long story short, how adolescents spend their time on age 14 doesn't seem to really predict anything.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Age 17.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think we may have all. Yeah. Maybe I will just pause there. Yeah. So again, in terms of the cohort chart that I showed you earlier, maybe it would be easy to say that screen time seems to be bad. But we think 3 years down the road, the result are much more mixed and not necessarily very consistent. And I think the big picture idea is that when we're modeling time, recognizing its limited nature, we seem to find all sorts of findings that actually shows that kind of like both camps of researcher are right in some specific way and wrong in some specific way. And we just hope to provide a language for them to be able to communicate this. I'm going to revisit this point in just a bit. So before I go into the broader discussion, I just want to summarize our findings a little bit. So our study is motivated by the displacement hypothesis. Again, the idea that screen time is bad because it's displaced time on socializing, for example. And we found that, it seems to really depends on the specific social partner. For example, we found that, spending more time on family, reducing alone screen time, is linked to more positive outcome. And that's consistent with some other literature. And we also found that perhaps somewhat surprisingly, and not a traditional idea that we would be able to test with conventional method, is that it turns out sacrificing alone non-screen time for screen time also tends to be linked to negative outcome, at least on weekdays. And again, the reason why that's surprising is that alone non-screen time is not a socializing time. So perhaps, again, me time is good in some way. And we also found that for period time, we see more mixed result depending on weekday or weekend. And it reinforces the idea that, this strikes us as very difficult to draw over a conclusion about whether or not screen time is bad or good, because it seems to really depends on is it weekday, is it weekend, what's the specific trade-off. So dividing time use based on social partners is one way to divide time use. Now that we've developed some of this like background on how we model this, I also want to show you a figure from a very similar study using the same data set, but now we're just splitting time by activity rather than by social partners. So this is cohort chart, same idea. We have screen time on the left in blue. We have passive time at the bottom, which is passive time is like time that you spend doing nothing or you feel bored. There's sleep. We have physical activity, that's physical exercise. We have active time that capture more things like cognitively active, like you're going to a concert, you're attending cultural event, you're writing, reading, not for school purpose. Contracted time basically means schoolwork. Committed time basically means chores. Okay. So what we're seeing here. So let's just focus on screen time for a second. Oops. Let's focus on screen time for a second. we do see a whole bunch of smaller arrows that are pointing out to different domains, but there's a big arrow coming into screen time from passive time. So, if you're just sitting around doing nothing, actually using screen may actually be kind of neat. And the elephant in the room is that there's this massive passive time sector. And again, I think this type of cohort chart again reinforces the idea that it's very difficult to say whether or not screen time is good or bad, and maybe that's even asking the wrong question if we don't consider trade-off. And there are trade-off that's going to be good, there's trade-off that's going to be bad. So we just want to point out there's probably no consensus yet on how do we divide time, because as far as we can tell, we're some of the first group to approach adolescent time use from this particular angle. Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying, Felix?
Yeah, please.
So the screen time in this previous one, that is alone and not alone screen time, I guess? It's not distinguishable?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
The contracted time, so if you're doing homework on a computer, does that count as screen time or contracted time?
I think that would count. So, okay. So another limitation with this particular time use diary study is that when there are two things, so in the time use research, we call it primary activity and secondary activity. So if you are doing schoolwork on a screen, the participants can, so the instruction is to ask the student, ask the adolescent participants to report what they think is the major activity. And my intuition would suggest that, if someone's doing schoolwork on the screen, they would probably report this as contracted time.
That makes sense.
So there are time use methodology that try to account for like secondary activity and tertiary activity. But I think this is actually a massive undertaking. I haven't collected time use data myself. Yeah, so getting high quality time use data that also have secondary, tertiary activity, that would be ideal.
Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you for all the clarifying question. I know that again, this type of topics, because we're moving beyond the screen time, and we're thinking about how again, like a time use domain all interact with each other, can be a lot. Yeah, so thank you for all those clarification questions. Okay, so again, I do think that our empirical results are kind of cool, but I think they're meant to be more illustrative of possible future research. To be able to directly test the displacement hypothesis, we need to be able to account for trade-off in social time or activity time or just time use in general. And to do this, we need to have 24-hour time use diary and to apply compositional data analysis to it. The reason why I'm particularly excited about joining the seminar series is that I think time use data is actually not uncommonly collected by things like statistical office and by economists. My understanding is that in the past context, is usually collected to capture things like unpaid domestic labor, for example. So they tend to be about data. They tend to be collected from adults, but not necessarily kids. But all those, resources, technology, the know-how of how to collect time use data is actually incredibly valuable when answering this question around adolescent time use. And I also think this perspective allows us to reframe the question from, how can adolescents, to reframe the question from is screen time good or bad, to how can adolescents spend their limited time for a better life? And I think it allows for better consensus building. Perhaps people on opposite side of the screen time debate, so to speak, can actually agree, for instance, that sacrificing sleep for screen time, is possibly bad. Or the literature can at least be built in a way that's a lot more specific. And it would allow us to agree and disagree in way more specific way. Maybe the part that we truly disagree on is, for example, whether spending me time versus screen time is good or bad. But there are other trade-offs that we can actually get on board that, actually both sides feel fine to agree on something. And we felt like the reason why this perspective is important is that it's sort of shift from this like debate perspective to an overarching goal that everyone is on board. So I've touched on several times how, I am a strong believer that we need to have stronger causal evidence before we can talk about like societal implications and things like that. And you can see a lot of intervention studies that are very well-meaning. They're currently being done or done in the past where they do things like screen time detox intervention. And we believe, those studies have also mixed findings, partly because they're not modeling specific trade-offs. If I'm not spending time on social media, there could actually be worse things I could be doing, and that would actually lead to a backlash. Purely anecdotally, in a previous time when I give this talk, another researcher who is also a parent shared with me that, when their kids are gaming at home, at least they know that the kid is not out there doing drugs. So it seems like some of this idea is actually somewhat intuitive. So again, intervention may help build that stronger causal literature if we focus on specific trade-offs. And recommendation on time, you should also take trade-off into consideration. So when we say that kids shouldn't be spending more than 2 hours on screen, well, what should they be spending time on? So another way that I've said this before is that current screen time research would at best only give us half the answer to the question. It can tell us maybe what not to spend time on, but it doesn't tell us what to actually spend time on. So this may seem so extremely obvious, but the main takeaway from this entire talk is just that time is limited. We need to take this idea seriously in time use research, and but this is currently not the most common practice when people are studying screen time. And we want to point to how we can align our theory, displacement hypothesis, with the data, 24-hour time use data, with our statistical method, compositional data analysis. It's only with good theory, good data, and good method that we can answer this question. I think I'm saying some extra slides I prepared, but I realize I'm about time. And so maybe I will just point out how time is also not just limited. Time is also unidirectional. It can only go in one direction. So we have a whole other paper that recently got accepted for publication that think about time use as a sequence. Even though we measure screen time in total screen time use, if a kid report they spend 4 hours of screen time in a day, it could be a huge chunk of 4 hours straight of screen time. It could also be like small 5-minute chunks that spread out throughout the day. And this sequence of time use is also basically completely ignored in the literature. So sometimes when I think about why we're studying screen time, I feel like I'm saying things that are kind of obvious, like time is limited and time is unidirectional are probably two most fundamental properties of time. But they're not currently being considered in the literature. So maybe I will give one final example. Again, I'm conscious of time. But I started this talk by talking about how we felt like past research have been taken seriously, that when they're thinking about intervention, they're not thinking about trade-off. We talk about how leisure time, green space, spending money on experiences are great, but we don't think about where are those time, space, and money coming from. So we have also explored how compositional data analysis can be applied to governmental expenditure. And the very long story short is that we're trying to model the human cost of increased military spending around the world, and increasing military spending has to come from some other domain, and how can a country spend their time? In this case, spend their money. So even if an increase in military spending is inevitable, how can the reallocation be done in a way to minimize the human cost, the well-being cost? My final slide is, a small plug for our own McGill U of T Wellbeing Research Seminar. Our next one is on December 1st. Again, given the time, I'm just going to leave this slide on while I answer questions. But yeah, so we also run a seminar series where we feature Kelsey research. So thank you so much again for having me. Yeah, and if you want more of this type of content, feel free to join our seminar series. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Felix. Everyone, please feel free to either raise your hand or write in the chat. Mark, I see you've asked a question. If you'd like, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask. You're the first person.
I'll give it a go, but I'm worried that my microphone is not working. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes,
I can
we hear you.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, thanks, Felix. That was a really interesting talk, and I've really like that you're trying to bring, as you say, method theory and data to bear on this issue. I spend too much time in like causal inference talks where no one's really bringing any theory out. And I appreciate all the challenges that you have with data. Nonetheless, is there anything you can say about heterogeneity and nonlinearity of effects? Like, is there any way to get at whether the intensity of these effects shifts depending on the absolute amount of screen time? And is there any way to control for the quality of the alternate uses of time? So when I talk colloquially about these issues with some colleagues of mine, they say things like, well, the people who are most online are often people who are excluded from their peer groups or from their family because they're trans, for example, and then they can't easily swap to peer time, and swapping to peer time might be bad anyway, things like that. Is there any way to kind of pick up some of those nuances? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that I think these are exactly the kind of question that we need to answer, and this is a question that can potentially be answered if we have even more time-use data. So for heterogeneity, so one thing that we've tried to look at is things like, is there any moderators? The most common one that's talked about is like sex differences in screen time use, with somewhat more research showing that perhaps adolescent girls have worse outcomes when they spend more time on screen. If I remember, so off the top of my head, I remember for the activity type study, we did look at moderation by sex, and in fact find some limited evidence that adolescent girl tends to have worse outcome when they spend more time on screen. And this accounting for some of this trade-off. In terms of non-linearity, we don't know whether or not this is going to be about a power issue, but we try to fit a compositional data analysis with spline regression, so a more data-driven way to measure nonlinear association. Our framing of the question may sound interesting. We're trying to find out like what is this perfect day that adolescent can live, so that they can have best well-being. Because with nonlinear association, you can try to find how to trade off all this stuff so that you can have the best well-being. But we basically found no significant nonlinearity. This could be due to a power issue, which goes back to my bigger point about how we need way more 24-hour time-use data. But I think that's good intuition, and it's an intuition that we have tested, and at least in our data, we don't seem to see strong evidence for it. Again, we don't know whether or not there's a power thing, or whether or not there's truly just no nonlinear association. And finally, I think you also asked a great question about yes, it's about quantity of the time, but it's also about quality of the time. Because there's a secondary data analysis, we don't have control over the primary data that we collected. Elizabeth and I are planning, to collect some primary data where we can get at some of this stuff, like motivation or the quality of both screen time and non-screen time use. And you can see in the screen time literature, there's a common literature that talk about how people switch activities between screen time. So why do they go from using Instagram to now using YouTube to now using Netflix and stuff? But that literature, my belief is that it's also limited because it's not accounting for things like, why do someone goes from watching Netflix to go for a walk in the park? So, people can also switch tasks from the digital world to the, to the real world. So I think my big point here is, again, like, we cannot do everything. Like, we think we need more people that study screen time and bring this perspective with them. And now the literature would be so much more richer, and now we can build recommendations and intervention in a way that is, reflect reality more, basically.
Thank you, Felix. We have 3 questions in the chat and about 8 minutes left. Felix, unfortunately, has to leave on time. So we have Letizia. You can go first. So if everyone could keep their questions and the answers short, hopefully we can address everyone. Rutger, you'll be afterwards, and Namabisa afterwards, after Rutger. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you for this very interesting contribution on this literature. I was wondering whether you could distinguish which kind of screen time we're talking about exactly, but I guess maybe you're limited by the data because I'm supposing that social media, times on social media is different from times on watching TVs, especially if you are interested in socialization, because you can also socialize through social media actually. And at the meantime, I was really surprised by the fact that the replacement with peer time has no significant effect, if I understood well. So I was wondering if you have some insight for these results. And at the meantime, I'm currently working on the youth well-being crisis, and I'm trying to understand the structural determinants of it. And one candidate is, of course, the increased use of social media. That is documented by Hayes, you presented at the beginning of your presentation. And one other argument that it brings up is the decline in unstructured play. And I was wondering, in that setting where unstructured play can be integrated, in which type of time use, and then what can be the link between the use of screen time and the replacement with unstructured play. Did you have the opportunity to explore that? And then a last comment just on the collection on data and like cohort studies on Jung. It's quite hard to get you right.
Yeah.
But I have some suggestion because I already went a bit through and trying to scrap some data on it. And there is some national
Letizia?
cohort study that can be interesting also, but maybe we can.
Yeah, sorry, I was
That's
just going to say,
yeah.
just given the questions, let's keep more detailed things to afterwards.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm totally
That's
happy to chat more after this, but maybe I'll answer maybe the key question that you brought up seems to be about the structured play. Maybe I'll answer that quickly. So to be clear, we found that spending time with peer over screen is good on the weekdays. And at least in the paper, our current speculation, our discussion point is about how play on the weekdays could be more structured. It could be, organized by school. And there are previous research that have also found that, organized or structured activities can be good. So that would be my quick response. The null result is about spending time with peers on weekends, and those tend to be way more unstructured. So that could be one reason. But that would be how I place, your question into our result. And again, it sounds like we're going to chat more, but maybe we can get to some other questions too.
Rutger, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting, extremely interesting and valuable research. I just wanted to connect Mark and Letitia's question a little bit because in the Heights book, it's very much a gendered issue because he argues that the screen time of girls and boys are very different, with girls more on social media and boys more on games and porn. And so, of course, the impact on well-being would be very different. So I think Letitia also specifically asked you whether it would be possible to have more knowledge about the screen time, or is the data just limited there?
Mm-hmm.
And the second issue is more a suggestion, I think, for future research. I am hearing a lot of this talk that actually people now online are getting AI companionship. So even this idea of peer interactions is actually going to be quite weird, where there's actually human peers and AI peers, and that probably is not for this paper, of course, but that's an extremely interesting area of research, I would argue. But maybe just on the screen time and the gendered effects, is there any possibilities there or not?
Yeah, so I will answer the first question quickly because that's also aligned with the previous question. So can we break down screen time, basically? So compositional data analysis is somewhat sensitive to missing data. So if there's not a ton of people spending time or in a domain, it kind of breaks down. So, how you divide up time use is, you see, big question. So in the context of the Millennium Cohort study, they do measure screen time with some resolution. I think that's one that's called social media, but they no longer break it further down into, I don't know, YouTube, TikTok, whatever. So I think Elizabeth is planning a study where we're going to break screen time at least into social media and non-social media screen time use, because we found that at that level of distinction, we still have enough data. So we still have enough data to run Coda, basically. But we won't be able to compare across all domains of screen time. Like we cannot compare social media with TV, with texting, with whatever. But at least we would be able to get at social media screen time and non-social media screen time. And that's an ongoing study.
Great. That's really interesting to know what's there. Namabisa, please feel free.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Felix. Thank you so much for sharing. My study is in South Africa, or focuses on South African undergraduate students, so university students. So I'm interested because, I wanted to ask, compared to adolescents, do you think that the relationship between screen time and well-being might shift in university students since, it's a digital age and now technology is more integrated in academic and social functioning? And also, do you think that it would be considered a negative impact?
Yeah, so I think whether or not is a negative impact, I think goes back to the main takeaway from the talk, which is it's probably impossible to talk about whether or not screen time is good or bad. It's probably have to be about specific trade-off. And if I'm thinking about college student in final period and they're sacrificing all their sleep for all this other stuff, that cannot be good for long-term well-being. But if they help them cope with their stress in the short term, that may be nice. I think my very long story short would be, I think that's so important. Time use is not just important for adolescents, it's important for young adults, for working adults, for older adults that are retiring. They also experience major shift in time use. And I think the whole point is that I think there's a whole field that is out there for us to pursue if we have a lot more time use data. We can answer all sorts of questions about how different groups can use time use differently. Maybe my final note, since you asked about this from a more global perspective, I do want to highlight sometimes a little bit of frustration with current time use research that is constantly framing this about how screen time seems to be always bad. But think about this in a global context. I think I read about this in Nepal. In some developing countries that are authoritarian in nature, sometimes social media is the only way for people to get information outside of state media. And there are definitely places where screen time and social media are playing a positive impact. And that would only be a perspective that someone have, is that if they're not thinking about this question from a purely sort of Western-centric developed world kind of perspective. So maybe that's my final thought, to say that there's so much more to be done. And when we bring in global perspective, different age group, again, I feel like there's a whole area of research here.
Thank you, Felix. I think you've sold us. There's a lot to be done. You have some beautiful data, and I'd like to see more. So thank you very much. We'll close it here. If you have any final points for us, I can let you share those. Otherwise, we'll shut it down.
Yeah, maybe I will just say that it seems like a lot of interesting questions. I don't have my contact here, but if you just look at Felix Cheung, U of T, you should be able to find me. Please send me questions. I'm happy to collaborate. Yeah, thank you again so much for being here. And thank you so much again for having me.